Hi there, this is episode 84 of Prague Talk, a podcast from Radio Prague International. My name is Ian Willoughby. Our guest in this edition is Benjamin Tallis, a Berlin-based foreign policy expert. He used to live in Prague and still spends a lot of time here. Last month, Ben had the Czech launch of his essay collection To Ukraine with Love, in which he says the Ukraine crisis has provided an opportunity to revive a European Union that had lost its way. He also identifies a new approach to foreign affairs, seen in, among others, Czech Foreign Minister Jan Lipavský, which he has dubbed neo-idealism. And Benjamin Tallis and I discuss all that and more in this edition of Prague Talk. If I could start with one of the first lines in your book where you say that Russia's war and Ukraine's heroic resistance have had a clarifying effect. Could you elaborate on that, Ben?
I think that the war and Ukraine's resistance have had a clarifying effect in the following ways. They've shown us what it is we need to stand up for and how. That if we don't defend democracy, it can die. And that's what Ukrainians have been willing to die for. And I think that's given us the wake-up call to say this is something we can't rely on being there forever, that we have to actively fight to defend our freedom. And that's made a lot of other things simpler in a lot of ways. What it is we prioritize and what we don't, what kind of actions we take and what we don't. But on an individual level, for many of us, I think it's been a prompt to make our own work and our own words clearer. And whether that's through our activity on social media or through, in my case, my professional work, I think that's the clarifying effect it's had.
You have put forward a new idea in foreign affairs, which is neo-idealism. What actually is it?
What it is a morally based approach to foreign policy, a morally grounded approach to geopolitics that puts values first and actually claims that our values are our interests. And there's often this definition or distinction that's made in international affairs between values and interests. And neo-idealists, I think, don't see that distinction clearly. They say our values such as democracy, freedom, fundamental freedoms, human rights, collective self-determination for democratic societies, and crucially also the hope of progress, they see those as being our interests and actually the way to better ourselves. And that, I think, is what has underpinned the response, particularly from Central Eastern Europe, but not only from Central and Eastern Europe, to Russia's full-scale invasion. And you can see it in the actions that have been taken, the material support. For example, the Czech Republic being the first to deliver main battle tanks to Ukraine, Estonia committing a staggering proportion of its GDP to supporting Ukraine. Other countries, Latvia, Lithuania, really stepping up and punching above their weight in terms of economy or population size because this so clearly matters to them. And we've seen that material support accompanied by the rhetoric of moral values. And Kaja Kallas has been very clear about this. Jan Lipavský has been very clear about this. So too has Petr Fiala. And it's that combination of morality and material that really underpins neo-idealism.
What is it about Jan Lipavský in particular that makes him a neo-idealist, as you would put it?
Well, he's been very clear from the outset of the full-scale invasion that Ukraine's fight is our fight too, and that's something he shares with some of the other neo-idealists. But he's been very clear that this is about defending our values, and it's about, in a way, living in truth, you could say, to use the Havelian term. And Lipavský takes inspiration from Havel, and specifically when he was talking, I think it was to Voice of America last year, he spoke about inhabiting that legacy and understanding that the recovery of that Havelian type of politics is something that underpins the Czech response and his response to Russia's full-scale invasion. And I think that's something actually that the neo-idealists have in common. It's the recovery of that politics of the 1990s, which was not only morally driven and coming off the back of the dissident movements who opposed the communist regimes and struggled for independence again in the Baltic states, struggled to be free from occupation here in the Czech lands. But it's also about recovering the hope of that time too. This was a hopeful time when things, as a limitless sense of possibility, there was a future to aim for. And I think it's that's also makes Lipavský one of the neo-idealists, someone who's very comfortable attending the Prague Pride Parade, supporting increased inward migration in a legal way, supporting liberal rights across societies, a thoroughgoing liberal vision. And I'd say that's what makes Jan Lipavský a neo-idealist.
Is 1968 also a factor in this? It's slightly unrelated perhaps, but after the full-scale invasion began last year, I heard of several people here who were essentially packing emergency bags that they could run with if it came to that. Is that kind of dormant fear of Russia something that's a factor in this?
I think what's been very clear across Central Eastern Europe is that historical resonance of what has happened, that still within living memory, there is experience of being invaded, being occupied by Russia or Russia-backed forces, by the Soviet Union. And that certainly has, I think, driven part of the response, is that knowledge of what it means to live in unfreedom, what it means to live in oppression, and the very direct connection people make to that through their families. But I think, again, on the other side, there's also the realization of the need to defend and the need to fight for that. And when Czechs have saved their own money, contributed to donating their own tank, have been willing in some cases to heat fewer rooms in the winter, to stand up and be counted, really. I think that's part of that historical legacy, but it's also about reclaiming the future and reclaiming the hope of a better future. And that's what Zelensky said to the US Congress last year when he spoke to them. He said, this is about the future we want for our grandchildren. So it's not only about grandparents and the 68 generation, it's about grandchildren and looking forward.
How much is President Zelensky himself the embodiment of your idea of neo-idealism? You say he's convinced us all that Russia's war in Ukraine is actually a war on all of us.
He's a huge figurehead for neo-idealism. Certainly he's spearheaded this in the most trying of circumstances and shown what it means when you've got your back to the wall to be able to look the opponent in the eye and let them know that you're willing to fight and that you're not going to go down without a fight. That famous statement on the second night of the war, that I need ammo, not a ride, really speaks to this and says that we are here, we are going to defend freedom and democracy. And I think what he's been able to do, but he wouldn't have been able to do without the support of his population in doing this, is to show that it would have been easier in some ways to surrender. But it's not worth doing that. It's worth standing up and worth defending these values. It's worth dying for them. And so he certainly is an embodiment of neo-idealism. And as you rightly say, I think he's shown that Ukraine's fight is only one front in the wider struggle for democracy against tyranny, for freedom and for our future. But he's, again, has not been able to do that alone. It's the Ukrainian people who've stood with him doing that. So where he's channeled that, and very effectively by what David Frum said, how did he put it? He said, Zelensky's recalled us to ourselves, recalled us to the best we can be. And I think that's the effect he's had on people around the world, not only members of the public, but politicians too. And certainly when I saw him speak recently in Vilnius, and it was a privilege to be there in person. I mean, you don't get to see Churchill every day live. You could see it was from the highest level of officials and politicians down to the everyday people watching this. It was an electrifying effect he had on them. And so I think that shows you the possibility that we have to actually take this as a political movement further.
For me, perhaps the most interesting thing you say in the book is how the Ukraine crisis could be a spark to revive the European Union. How could that possibly happen?
Yes, the Ukraine crisis has asked questions, and let's say Russia's invasion of Ukraine has asked questions of the European Union that it had been wanting to avoid having to answer for a long time. In my understanding of this, which I explain in the book, I think the European Union succeeded because it had a unique mode of geopolitics. It was never not a geopolitical organization, as some people say, but rather it had a very creative mode of geopolitics that saw that mutual entanglement between the countries of the EU through integration would help people meet, it would help businesses work together, it would help governments work together. And by doing that, you take the danger out of difference, you take the fear and the animosity that had ruled the European continent for years and transformed it into the mutual pursuit of common interest underpinned by common values. And that was where I think the European Union really succeeded, through this progressive deepening of integration, but also through its enlargement and the enlargement of that geopolitics to more countries, including famously in 2004, 8 post-socialist states, including the Czech Republic. Now, it was about at that time that I think the EU started to lose its way. Instead of what I've described as a progressive mode of security, seeing opportunities to be taken exactly by expanding to countries who wanted to be included, and by seeing that you could, from what were really terrible times after the Second World War, you could salvage the hope of a better future if you worked for it together. I think then the EU got scared, and it also got selfish and a little bit lazy, and this prompted a different kind of logic, a protective security logic that came particularly after 9/11, but was also speaking to trends that have been going on within the EU for a while, that seeking to protect what we had rather than further grow and further develop. And I think the EU is a little bit like a tuna. If it stops swimming, it's going to die. And I think it was in the process of a slow, painful route to death, because it wasn't expanding, because it wasn't deepening, and because it wasn't doing what it was supposed to do for people anymore. And it was that narrow-minded and threat-based mentality that, ironically enough, the huge threat from Russia kicked it out of. And you see that change in one thing very particularly that I'd say, its attitude towards membership for Ukraine. And when Ursula von der Leyen said on the 27th of February last year, they're one of us and they belong with us, that really upturned 2 decades of EU policy into 2 short sentences. And it's that possibility, again, of expanding, the possibility of including Ukrainians, and therefore making it something better for us all, that I think really gets the EU back to what it's good at.
Looking to the future, or the potential future, I guess I've heard you say that Ukraine would need to join NATO before joining the EU. Why do you believe that?
I think that's the order that makes sense, because Ukraine's recovery and reform process needs to be underpinned by security, and the only real security guarantee in town is NATO membership. And I think that's what's going to be required for the investment that will be needed for Ukraine to recover. Now, that's not going to happen overnight, and so an interim solution needs to be found. I've proposed extending the Joint Expeditionary Force to countries of the willing, including Ukraine and Poland, which I think would provide a pathway into NATO. But it's absolutely essential that Ukraine has a secure future, and the secure part comes from NATO, the future part comes from the EU.
How likely is it, do you think, if we look to the future, let's say 10, 15, 20 years in the future, will Ukraine actually be a member of these organizations, do you believe?
It will. I'm confident it will. Otherwise, those organizations probably won't exist, because I think this is the acid test for both of them to a significant degree. As I said, Ukraine gives the EU the chance to recover its raison d'etre, and it's the spirit that animates it that actually makes it good at what it's doing. Similarly, NATO exists to secure Europe and secure the transatlantic area. Without Ukraine inside NATO, I don't think it's possible to have a lasting security settlement in Europe in particular. And given the other security challenges that the US faces, for example, in the Indo-Pacific, and that all democracies face around the world, without a secure Europe, then I don't think NATO serves its purpose. So for both organizations, Ukraine's entry into them is existential for them.
If I could ask you a more personal question, you're a strong and vocal supporter of Ukraine. The Ukrainians have suffered so much. The solution does not seem in sight. Do you ever despair?
When I worked in Ukraine nearly 20 years ago, there was a Ukrainian artist who I knew, who at some point said to me during a conversation, when I was expressing my doubts about the EU mission in Ukraine, he said, "You don't have the right to lose hope. We Ukrainians might lose hope because we have to live this every day, but you, with your conditions that you have, with your advantages that you have, you do not have the right to lose hope. You do not have the right to despair." And that's been something that's stuck with me ever since. It's a kind of check your privilege moment in a way. And I think that's what a lot of people have felt. As we go through the ups and downs, following it so closely with Ukrainians, being in touch with Ukrainians, following the progress at the front, there are days, of course, which are better than others, but at the same time, we have to keep going. And it's that rekindling of the fires of hope, if you like, that I think underpins neo-idealism, from the level of me personally to the level of governments that want to do something about the geopolitics of it.
My final question, Ben, how likely is it, do you think, that some solution can be found that would be acceptable to Ukraine?
The only real acceptable solution is for Russia to get out of Ukraine. And Ukrainians have been clear about that. That includes Crimea. It means restoring the 1991 borders. But at the moment, the West isn't giving Ukraine the weapons it needs to do that quickly. Ukraine will be able to do it, but it will take a long time and be at high cost. And I think that's absolutely why we have to step up our support in order to have a solution that's acceptable for democrats around the world, for democracies, for free societies around the world. We need Ukraine to win. This is in our interest as well as keeping with our values. And so that's why we have to arm Ukraine to win as soon as possible and at the lowest human cost possible. And if we really understand that and understand that this is our fight too, that's exactly what we'll do. And I'm confident there are enough of us who continue fighting for that to get Ukraine what it needs to win, that it will eventually happen.
Benjamin Tallis' essay collection, To Ukraine with Love, is available online and well worth picking up. This has been episode 84 of Prague Talk, a podcast from Radio Prague International. If you're new to us, why not check out some of the older editions and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. For now, from me, Ian Willoughby, thank you very much indeed for listening to Prague Talk. and talk to you again very soon.